wants a spooky needle felting tutorial for Halloween. My name is Charlotte Allen and you've reached my channel, The Felting Alchemist. I really wanted to do a Halloween needle felting tutorial for you today, and I'm a massive fan of 80s fantasy films, and I was watching Return to Oz, which is one of my favourite films, and one of the characters in it, Jack Pumpkinhead, really inspired me to go ahead and make my own kind of version. So it's not Jack Pumpkinhead because I don't want to get sued by people at Disney, it's an inspired version of Jack Pumpkinhead. So we're going to be making this chap here, and I really love him because he's on a wire armature, so he's lovely and poseable, and he can wave to you, hello. And he's also got Fimo hands as well, so we're going to be incorporating some Fimo into this sculpture today and integrating it in with the needle felting. And his head has also been attached with polyamide thread, which also means that he can turn his head, hello, and he can bend his head as well, which is very satisfying. So you can put him into all kinds of crazy poses. So let's take a look at the materials you're going to need to create this spooky yet cute little chap. Now there's quite a lot of different materials in this tutorial, so I'm going to break it down for you into different sections. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is the body. Now for the body, in terms of your wool, you're going to need around about 20 grams of a white core wool. So I've got a Shetland white here, but you can use any core wool you want to, as long as it kind of wraps around an armature nicely. You're also going to need around about 10 grams of an orange wool bats as well. So this is a merino wool bats that I've got here, but any wool bats will do really. You're going to need a small amount of black wool bats. So this again is just a merino, but you can use any wool that you want to. And then finally, you're going to need a brown wool bat. So I've got a brown Corriedale here because I really like the fact that you've got all these different colours going through it. And because this is going to be for like the stick parts of his body, I quite like that it's different colours and it's kind of variegated, if you like. So that's what you're going to need for the main body and the head. For his clothing, you can choose any colours you want really, but two of the colours that you use, they're going to be the main core of the clothing, so you want to have more of those than the others. So I've got my blue here, which is going to be for his trousers. So you want about 6 grams for this. You want about 6 grams for the pink wool, and then the purple wool, which is going to be for his braces and his shoes, you probably want around about 4 grams. And then likewise with the red wool bats, you're going to need about 4 grams again to make his scarf. And then also as an option, you can also get a bit of green wool bats, and that can form part of the kind of the stalk on the top of his pumpkin head where it's kind of come out of the ground, but you don't have to use that if you don't want to. To make the body, you're going to need some floristry wire. So I've got 3 pieces here and they are 18 gauge and they are about 31 centimeters in length. So ideally you want to go with 18 gauge or around sort of 20 gauge, something like that, but you don't want to go any higher than that because it gets a bit stiff and difficult to work with then. But anywhere between 18 gauge and kind of, I don't know, 24 gauge, something like that is probably about right. So you'll need 3 of these, and you'll also need an extra piece of floristry wire to make his hands on, which leads me on to my next material. So you're going to need some brown Fimo, and this is going to be to make his hands. And I'm going to show you one I've made earlier here. So this is another kind of sample that I've started making, but his arms were a bit long, so I haven't used him in the tutorial. But just so you can get an idea, what I've done is I've taken the Fimo and I've got the wire, and I've basically got a ball of Fimo, and then I've rolled it with my hands out into this length. You don't want it as long as this, you'll want it much shorter, probably about a quarter of the length, I would say. And then I've taken some extra pieces of Fimo and then I've just attached them on as 3 fingers, and then just blended it with my fingers so you can't see where the joins are. And then I've just baked it in the oven at about 120 on a fan for about 20 minutes. And I've placed the arms on corn flour so they keep their shape. And you leave the wire inside, so that way when you remove the wire, once you've made your armature, you can add your hand on again with some glue. So that's how I've made my hands. They're dead simple to do, really straightforward. And if anybody needs any more advice in relation to how to make them, let me know in the comments and I can give you some more hints and tips. You're also going to need some jute string. I've got a big roll of it here. This is probably about the right amount of thickness that you want. You don't want to go too thick with this because you've got to remember that your sculpture is still quite fine and delicate. So I think this is about 4 millimeters in thickness, something like that. So nothing massive. You're going to need a dark brown pastel chalk. So I've got one here that is quite a dark colour. So something like this colour is what you want to go for. And you're also going to need a very fine paintbrush as well to use it with. You're also going to need super glue. I like Gorilla Glue, but you don't have to go with Gorilla Glue if you don't like it. You can go with whatever preferred super glue you like to use. And you're also going to need a small cocktail stick as well, just to help us get that kind of curled look to the kind of the root that's coming out of his head as we get towards the end of the tutorial. tools wise, you're going to need a felting mat, and then you're also going to need a brush mat as well for certain elements of the sculpture as we go through the tutorial. You're also going to need some fine twisted needles and a needle felting pen, and I've just got 2 in here. And then you're going to need 2 medium twisted needles as well, also in a needle felting pen. You want your 7 needle multi-tool, and in here I've just got 7 fine triangular needles. And then you're also going to need a medium cross-star twisted needle for doing some of the finer work on our sculpture towards the end of the tutorial. You're going to need a tape measure for measuring certain elements out, some wire cutters, some polyamide thread, and a medium-sized dull needle. So you're going to need quite a few tools and materials for this tutorial, but it is definitely worth it for the finished result. So let's get stuck in. So the first thing you want to do is take one of your wire armatures and fold it in half, because we're going to be making the body for our Mr. Pumpkinhead. So I'm going to turn this 1, 2, 3 times. We don't need it to be really long, our twist. And then I'm going to take our second wire and fold that in half as well. And then once that's folded in half, I'm going to place that over the front of the first armature that we folded in half. Hold it just under the neck area, and then I'm going to fold the legs and the arms round 4 times. If you want to look at how I make a wire armature in more detail, then you can follow this playlist just up here, and it will show you where you need to go, and I'll give you a bit more detail in relation to how I make my wire armatures. So next I'm going to just make his body, so I'm going to fold those 2 wires one over the other. And I'm going to go for about 6 to 7 twists here. I'll go for a 7th, I think, because we want him to have quite a long torso, and that's what this part is going to form. And then I'm just going to straighten him out and just see where his limbs and his legs are. So his arms are far too long at the moment, and his legs are far too short. So what I want to do next is take my 3rd piece of wire. I'm going to fold this one in half as well. Then I'm going to take my wire cutters and I'm going to cut this one in half. I'm then going to hold it under one of my legs. So I've got about 2.5 inches coming out. And then I'm just going to fold that 2.5 inches up the top of the leg. Okay. All the way up to the very top, twisting it until I've twisted that end inwards. And then do the same with the bottom half, twisting it in the same direction all the way down to the bottom of the wire. So we're creating more length here because we want his legs to be really nice and spindly and stick-like. And I'm just going to do the same thing now with the second leg. So twisting that first piece of wire up the top and then twisting the rest of it, the length of it, down to the bottom. So I'm just going to straighten those out now. Just see how they look and just get rid of any sharp ends. So you should eventually have 2 legs that are a lot longer, and I'm just going to measure everything for you now. So his head should measure just under 1 inch, but if it's about 1 inch, don't worry too much. The triangle part of his torso should be about 1 inch, and then from the top of the shoulders all the way down to where the torso ends, it's about 2.5 inches-ish. And then his legs are measuring 6 inches. So what we want to do next is we just want to fold those ends up on his feet so they don't kind of hurt anybody with the sharp pointy ends. So I'm just going to fold up about 1 centimetre on his foot just to get rid of that sharp wire there. And I'm just going to do the same on the other side and just compare them next to each other just to make sure that they're both equal. Because while symmetry isn't massively important in this tutorial, we do want his legs to be the same length, otherwise he's going to be like a bit of a hop along. He's going to be very wobbly as he walks around. And then once that's done, I'm just going to take my felting wax, which you can purchase in my shop, and this is just going to help us to get the wool to stick to our wire armature as we wrap it round. And I'm just going to rub this all over the wire armature. But it just makes life so much easier when it comes to wrapping the wool around rather than it kind of slipping away. I'm then going to take a length of my white Shetland core wool, quite a long length. I'm going to place it between his legs. So I've got about 2.5 inches coming out from in between his legs. And then I'm just going to move those out the way. And then I'm just going to wrap it very tightly around my first leg. And I'm going to go all the way down to his foot here. So what you can do two different ways of wrapping this. You can twist, like I'm showing you here, or you can wrap it round. I'm just going to get a bit of extra wax and I'm going to rub it between my thumb and my finger, just so I can get a bit more stick on my wool as I'm wrapping it. So I can just continue twisting here to get that tight wrap. So the twisting method does make life a lot easier, but because I've got such a long length of wool here, I've actually found that towards the end of the foot, this is a slightly easier method. So I'm going to go all the way down. I'm going to go past the wire. And then once I've gone past the wire, I'm then going to go work my way back up the leg. I'm just going to take a bit more wax and then I'm going to rub it between my thumb and my finger. And as I'm wrapping the wool, I'm using my thumb and my finger against the wool to just give a bit more slick to help it stay in place. Not slick, sorry, a bit more stick, not slick. I don't want slick, it'll all unravel. So I'm going to go all the way back up. And just be careful here that you don't let the wool twist around. Keep it all nice and straight so you don't end up with any horrible lumps and bumps in your leg. And take it all the way back to the very top of his leg. You just want to make sure that you're holding it nice and taut with your non-dominant hand as you're wrapping with your dominant hand, because the last thing you want to do is let go and for it to all unravel. Going all the way to the top. And then once I'm at the top, just get rid of those last few bits. I'm just going to wrap that a few times around the top part of his leg just to anchor that down into place so it doesn't unravel. Get rid of those loose bits there as well. So I'm just going to twist that last bit of wool around the bottom part of his leg. And then I'm just going to take the loose piece that we used to anchor everything down into place whilst we were twisting around the torso. And we're just going to build up some bulk around there now by doing this as well. And it just gets those sort of fiddly, fluffy bits out of the way. And again, just secures everything in place. So I'm just going to separate his legs out and I'm going to do exactly the same thing now with his second leg. So there we go. So we've got both our legs wrapped. The next thing to do is wrap his torso. So I'm going to place another length of white Shetland, this time between his legs. And then I'm just going to start wrapping it around the hip area, keeping it nice and tight and keeping it nice and straight. Don't let it twist over here because we want to keep everything nice and smooth looking for when we add the clothing later on. If we were making a bit of a Wurzel Gummidge character, I wouldn't be too worried, but we want this particular sculpture to be very refined, have very kind of almost an emaciated look to him. So once I've wrapped up towards sort of the armpits, I'm then going to take my wool and I'm going to place it over the shoulder furthest away from me, okay? Then I'm going to wrap it around the body again. And then I'm going to wrap it around the shoulder or over the shoulder closest to me. And then wrap it around the body again. And then go round that furthest shoulder away again for a second wrap. Round the body. And then back over the closest shoulder. And then wrap it back down again. So you want to just go for 2 wraps. You don't want to go for more than 2 because again, we want to keep this nice and smooth and very kind of emaciated looking, very stick-like. And if we add too much bulk, you're going to take away from that stick-like appearance that we want to go for with this sculpture. So I'm just going to wrap the rest of the wool down to the bottom of the torso. I'm just going to separate his legs out here. Keeping it nice and tight. As you're wrapping, or as I'm wrapping I should say, I'm keeping my fingers nice and close to the wool as I'm pulling it tight. You don't want to pull far away because what will happen then is you'll end up pulling your wool off. So you want to keep your fingers nice and close to the wool as you're pulling it tight. And then once I've gone up a second time, I'm just going to felt that down into place using my fine twisted needles here in my needle felting pen. So nothing's going to unravel. but just be cautious of the wire here because you've got lots of wire very close to your needles. So just go careful as you're felting things down. I'm just going to felt down the bottom half as well. I'm just going to get rid of that fluffy bit, bring it up between the legs. Just wrap it again around that bottom part of the sort of what would be the hips and the torso, and felt that down too. Just try and get it nice and smooth. We're going to add more shaping as we add other layers of wool, so don't worry too much about the shape at the moment, but we do want to make sure that we haven't got any kind of ugly lumps and bumps. We want to make sure that everything is nicely integrated into our armature. The next thing you want to do is you want to wrap his neck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some more of my wool, I'm going to place it over his shoulder, and then I'm just going to tack those loose ends over his chest area, just so they're nice and secured down, they're not going to go anywhere. And then I'm going to wrap this around his neck as tightly as I can. And this is really important in terms of the rest of the tutorial. You don't want this to be loose because we're going to be using his neck to attach his head later on. And it's vital that it's really, really firm. If it's loose, the head won't stay on and it's going to fall off. So you really do need to make sure that this is as tight as you can wrap it. So I'm going to wrap it around a few times, hold it down with my nail, those loose ends there, and then just tack those down. And then once you've got your neck nice and firm, I'm just going to flick my feet up, roughly where I want my feet to be. And then we're going to work on his arms and his hands. Now his arms are a bit long at the moment, so I'm just going to trim about 1.5 inches off here with my wire cutters, and then just do the same on the other side, making sure that they're both equal in length. And then once I've done that, I'm just going to put my Fimo hand on that I made earlier on, and just check to see what the length's like. Now you don't have to go for the same length that I'm going for here. You could go for longer if you wanted to, or you could go for shorter, but just bear in mind that if you go for shorter, you're not going to have as much wire to make his arm poseable. So I'm just going to take a little bit of extra wire off here because they were a bit long for my personal preference. Just do the same on the other side. And then I'm just going to place my hand back on again. If I can get it on. There you go, that looks good to me, that looks better. So what I'm going to do now the hand's on is just bend that wire to roughly where the hand is going to sit. So I'm just going to put a bend in there, and then a bend in the second hand as well, second arm. So what I've done there is I've placed the hand on the wire, and then I've just bent it upwards so I know where the wire ends and where the hand begins, and that's going to be really crucial in a moment. And then I'm just going to take another piece of wool, felt it against the chest, and I'm going to wrap this down his arm. Just going to get a bit of wax there, and I'm going to go all the way down to where that bend is that we've just made using his Fimo hand. So using the same techniques that we've already been using for wrapping. We don't want to add lots and lots of bulk here. We want his arm to be quite spindly and very stick-like. So you don't need to add loads of bulk. I'm just going to make sure that that's nice and straight. And then once I've gone down to that bend, I'm just going to go back up again. But keep it nice and tight again. You don't want this to be loose. All of the armature, you want it to be nice and tight. Ideally, you don't want any of the wool to be loose because it's just going to make life a lot more difficult for you when it comes to wrapping and felting things later on. So the tighter you can get it, better really. So once you get to the end, I'm just going to bring that round to the back of his neck, get rid of that excess, and just felt that down so it's anchored into position and it's not going to unravel. And I'm just using my fine needles here to felt everything down. I'm not using my medium needles because we're doing something very tight. So the medium needles, because they're much thicker, would really struggle to penetrate the wool at this stage, whereas the fine needles go in a lot more easily. So you're able to felt everything down nice and tightly against the wire armature. But you obviously want to be really careful as you're felting against the wire armature that you don't hit the wire. So I'm going to take some of my brown Corridale next, a long strip. And I'm just going to again felt that initial piece to anchor everything down into place in between his legs against his torso. And then I'm just going to wrap this around his leg in exactly the same way that we wrapped our core wool around his leg earlier on. So I'm just going to make sure again that everything is nice and straight and keep everything again nice and firm and tight. So holding that wool really close as I'm pulling it round to then fold it round again. And I'm going to take it all the way down to the foot, past the wire, past the core wool that we've already added, and then come back up again. So you want enough wool here to go for a double wrap so you can get all the way down the foot and then all the way back up to the top of the leg, ideally. If it's a little bit short, don't worry too much because we're going to be adding some more wool in a moment. So I'm just going to take that all the way up until I have no more wool, and then I'm just going to felt that down, those last ends, just to anchor them into position. And I'm just going to give it a bit of a felt as well here because I've got a few lumps and bumps that I'm not too keen on. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And then I'm going to take another piece of the brown Corriedale, again felting it down into that torso area because we can take more wool there. We don't need to worry too much about having a little bit more wool there than we'd want to because his torso is going to be thicker. And then this time I'm going to wrap this around the sort of the top half of his leg. So I'm going to go all the way down, but I'm going to stop about halfway. I'm not going to go any further down than that. So to roughly where his knee would be, I would say. And then once I've gone down halfway, I'm going to come back up again. And we're just creating a bit more thickness here, a bit more of a thigh area. You don't have to do this. You could keep your sort of stick character a lot more thin and fine in terms of his limbs, but I just wanted to add a bit more bulk around his thigh area so that when we add his clothing later on, it sits a bit more naturally. So I'm just going to tack and felt down those loose ends that we've got there that we used to help us anchor everything down earlier. And I'm going to felt it into the torso because the torso can take a little bit more extra bulk, so I'm not too worried about it being a bit thicker. And then I'm just going to felt down that thigh area as well and just get that a bit smoother. Get rid of any of those lumps and bumps for when we add the clothing later. And then once I've done that, I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. So we've got two equal legs. Ta-da! Next I'm going to take another long length of that brown Corriedale and we're going to wrap his torso. So I'm just going to felt down a couple of inches just around the lower part of his hips there, just to lock those down. And then once I've felted those down, I'm going to wrap it around his torso in exactly the same way that we did earlier on when we were wrapping that core wool around his torso. So I'm just going to move his arms out the way. That's the really nice thing with doing a wire armature sculpture as well, is that you can move bits and pieces out the way if they're kind of causing you a few struggles and making you go all fingers and thumbs if they're in the way. Just bend them out of the way. And the wire is so strong, it's not going to break or anything like that. So I'm just going to wrap it around his shoulders. And then once I've wrapped it around his shoulders, I'm just going to take it again back down his torso. I think Return to Oz is probably one of my favourite 80s films. I really did love it. And when I sort of watched the film the other day, I felt so inspired to do this because it's so magical. And I think I've mentioned this before, but you can't beat a bit of 80s puppetry. You know, all those films from that period, like The Never-Ending Story and The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. Labyrinth was amazing. All of those films I absolutely loved. And it just made me feel really nostalgic watching it. I felt like I was, 7 again and really got into it. And I just think it's just so magical. All of those Henson films that were made in the 80s, they were really wonderful. They don't make films like that anymore. So I'm just going to felt this a bit just to get it nice and smooth. Get rid of any of those lumps. Still using my fine needles here. And the felt just kind of gives everything a bit more security. And it's going to give us a smoother base to work with when we're adding his clothing later on as well. And now that we've added quite a few layers of wool, it's a lot easier to use our needles in the body because we're not going to hit the wire as easily. So now that's done, we're going to wrap his neck. So we're going to do this again in exactly the same way that we did earlier. Just going to tack that down so it can't go anywhere. And then we're just going to wrap it round his neck. But I remember when I watched The Return to Oz for the first time, and I'd watched Wizard of Oz before, and I remember thinking, oh, I don't know if I like this, because I was and still am, a lover of musicals, and there was no singing in it, and I was quite disappointed that there was no singing in Return to Oz. I was waiting for them all to suddenly burst into kind of, somewhere over the rainbow, and they didn't, and I was absolutely gutted. But then in time, I just grew to love the film so much. But you can't beat the Judy Garland version, can you? That is probably one of the best films of all time. It's very much a Christmas film, I think, The Wizard of Oz. I absolutely love it. And again, it's all that classic kind of special effects that they don't really do anymore because everything's CGI. I don't know, my personal opinion is it's all got a bit lazy. Yeah, it looks amazing, but back in 1945 or whenever it was that they made The Wizard of Oz, everything was done, everything was made, all the props were made, all the special effects had to be created, people had lead put on their faces and they, had poisoning for the rest of their lives. I mean, good times. Right, so I'm just going to felt this down now. And you want to really felt that neck down again just to get it really, really solid. You don't want any looseness there. So try and get it as firm and as hard as you can, that neck area. So I'm just going to felt his feet a bit as well and just get those a little bit more tacked down, a bit firmer, because we want those to be nice and firm for when we add his boots later. But just be careful around the feet because the wire is a lot closer to your needles. So when you're felting, felt down the side, don't felt sort of directly into the wire because you will break your needles then. So just felt down the sides of the armature. So that is the first stage of our sculpture finished. So I really hope you enjoyed that part, and I can't wait to show you the second part tomorrow because in that part we're going to be adding his clothes and adding his hands, and he's really going to start taking shape. So I will see you tomorrow with the second part. Until then, have a wonderful day. Bye.